Good morning, 6th grade social studies class. It's me, Mr. Happy, and I am located in my secret location with my coffee and my green shirt because it is St. Patrick's Day. And so, today, I want to talk just very briefly with all of you a little bit about the history of Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. A reminder that after this video is posted, one way that you guys can get some credit for watching this is giving me some questions that you might have about what's been going on in the Middle East or something that we talk about in this video that you're really unaware of. So, it's very hard for me to condense the Middle East into a 10 to 15 minute video. So keep in mind that this is going to be what we will call the Cliff Notes of the Middle East. So, let's get started. Middle East is all about geography. All right. When we talk about geography and regions and how geography affects history, we can't really think of a better example than the Middle East. If you have your books open, you look at like a map of the Middle East, you notice that there are two very important rivers when we talk about the Middle East. Specifically, the Nile River that's located in Egypt and the Mesopotamian area that has the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, let's talk about Mesopotamia. It comes from the word that means between two rivers, and those, of course, are Tigris and Euphrates, which we talked a little bit about how those are some of the rivers that are in the Garden of Eden in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. When we talk about the Mesopotamian religions and cultures that developed out there, we see that a lot of the early people who lived in the Middle East focused primarily on farming because the Mesopotamian area flooded a lot. Okay? And so when you're living in a desert population and a desert world, what happens is that you are going to be as close to those water sources as possible. So really, when we look at the early history of the Middle East, they're crowded around these rivers. And so what starts off in their history is it's not really like big countries like the United States today. Instead, it's city-states. And that's where you have one city that kind of controls just like the area around it. So for instance, it'd be like if Springfield was just its own country. Okay? And we kind of controlled all the area around it, and we were fighting with like Lincoln and Jacksonville and other places for resources. And that's what these areas that start off were doing. Eventually, more and more city-states get power, especially around places like Babylon, which you might have heard if you know from the Bible. So I'm going to pause right there, talk about Mesopotamia, and then we go back over to Egypt. Now, Egypt gets a lot more press because we, in modern day, really like talking about Egypt. Egypt developed its own culture around the Nile River. It's very similar to Mesopotamia and actually to a lot of world civilizations. Rivers were really important. The river in Egypt was worshipped as a god, which is why in Exodus, Moses uses one of the first plagues to be a plague of blood. It kind of shows that God is more powerful. Okay? The Nile River developed or allowed Egypt to develop into a really advanced civilization for the time. It was very regular. And you might say, well, what does that mean, Mr. Happy? Well, what it means is that it was regular because it flooded regularly. And it didn't experience a lot of drought. So the people could rely on the Nile River for crops, for water, and for transportation. So what that meant is that when we look at modern day Egypt, if you look at like a map of modern day Egypt, you see that it's a relatively large country for in comparison to some other countries near it. However, during this time period, the Egyptians developed their culture really just around the Nile River. Okay, and this is where we get the pyramids, the worship of the dead. They revered the dead and their ancestors, and those pyramids are gigantic tombs where they put the pharaohs, which is Egyptian for king, into there. Now, other civilizations are developing at this time. One in particular is the Israelite civilization that's developing, you guessed it, near a river in the Jordan. The Jordan River is extremely important. Okay, so the Canaanite civilizations develop in the Jordan River, the Egyptians develop along the Nile River, and the Assyrian Babylonian civilizations develop near the Tigris and Euphrates River. Now, are there exceptions? Of course. You have the Hittites up in Turkey. You have the Persians over in Iran, which doesn't have as many rivers. But mostly, if there's water in the Middle East, you'll see the civilizations developing. So I'm going to skip just a little bit ahead and talk about Rome. Okay, now keep in mind that when I do that, I just skipped almost 2,000 years of Egyptian and Mesopotamian history, which we'll cover a little bit more in detail later on this week if you have questions about them. Okay, so Rome basically conquers all of the Near East, which is modern-day Egypt, modern-day Libya, modern-day Algeria, modern-day Israel, modern-day Turkey, modern-day Syria and Jordan, Lebanon, all these places that you can look on. And so the Romans developed their own culture, and they really, along with other Greek traders, really put Greek as a important cultural tool and cultural language for this area. So what happens is that Greek and the Greek philosophies become really important for the people who live in the Middle East. And what happens is you have this kind of weird blend. And that's one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're studying the Middle East, is that it's a crossroads. It's a crossroads between Africa and Asia and Europe. So when we talk about the Middle East as its own thing, that's because it really is its own thing. You don't see the blending of cultures, religions, beliefs, food, different engineering ideas, education, medicine, that you see in other areas. The Middle East has a lot of things in common with Europe. The Middle East has a lot of things in common with Africa. The Middle East has a lot of things in common with Asia. It's considered part of all three at times. And so the Romans kind of really bring in that European influence, along with Alexander the Great, who's before them. As we go through this week, we're going to look a little bit more in detail, but I want to just kind of use today's video as kind of an understanding that this is a blend. And so when we're going to be talking about, each video this week is going to be talking about a specific time in history, okay? So we really won't talk about the Egyptians. We may not talk about like the Babylonians. However, if you have something really specific about the more ancient history, go ahead and comment that on the video, or comment that on our Google Classroom, and I'll make that in the follow-up video today. Okay? But keep in mind that I'm going to be skipping around a lot of stuff because people have been living in the Middle East since recorded human history, i.e. the Bible. You have a lot of history to cover. So tomorrow, I'm going to go into depth about Islam and the rise of Islam and how it completely changes the history of the Middle East. So if you have a question about something that happened in the Middle East, whether it be in Egypt, whether it be something in the Bible, whether it be the Babylonian or Assyrian empires, the Hittites, the Philistines, the Romans, the Alexander the Great, any of those types of things, go ahead and comment below, and I'll follow it up with some Q&A today around 1 or 2 o'clock, okay? I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm looking forward to talking throughout this week to you about the Middle East. You guys have a great day, and remember, in spirit of St. Patrick's Day, go ahead and go into your garage with a rake and rake out any snakes that you have and shoo them away, okay? That's what St. Pat would want. Have a good day, guys.